Shunka ho, pelo yo hey ho, la kota ho kshila o tape shunka ho pelo. Shunka ho pelo yo hey ho, la kota ho kshila o tape shunka ho pelo, hey ho. That song that was saying when Custer's men were all arriving and the coyotes warned the camp that the enemy was coming. So the coyotes told our holy men that the enemy was upon them. So the music, the coyotes song and the interpretation for that song came for that purpose, to make aware the enemy was coming upon the camp. That song was made for that purpose. And that's why we have a connection to being able to communicate with the animals. Ha mitaku ya pile milo akil naji piogala ke yunka ho oglalo yanke sinchalko yanke wenu pana inslata emata ha mithoya te ki I wahachunka yuha money tioshpaya emata ha he na I Mambli o money ithacha etama hiu ho yunka her mons penavoslo le ke hena un ichach michelo cha toha lechel oyate tako hel oapcha hanta atami chelo chinta kumni ni tuwe nan ni tuwe tukte ya hiuki hechel unichiglakin telo hechel oyate tuktelia hiuki henache nawichak chiji naji na heta yahi o he o spaye hena tuepiki slolyapikte he lechel atamich elo. I was taught that song for the purpose of making me aware that the language, the method of communication, the orthography of the people has a connection to the history of language. So I surmise, in my belief, in my opinion, that how we came to creating a Lakota language had to come from having the ability to communicate with the spiritual world, but also the world that life gave us, and the communication with the four-legged, the winged, the fish nation, and the insects. They all have a method of communicating, and the language of their communication is contiguous to who they are and what they are in their lifestyle, in their life way. So as we, in the evolution of life, as we learned how to speak and how to communicate, we learned specific usages. I'll go back to what I was told, which sounded very interesting to me as I formulate a thought and a philosophy of the origination of language. In the creation story that was told, and a lot of people tell different methods, different types of creation stories. Well, the one I was told was, I heard it from Sievert Youngbear one time told a story when he said, my great-great-grandfather Smoke told the creation story. And he told that story in Lakota language. And to break that language, interpret it, would take a long time. So I'll give you a synopsis of what he said and how I understood it to be. He said, the old man Smoke said, the story was, in Mother Earth, all the spirits were resided in Mother Earth. And they were primarily life. However, on the level earth, here on earth, the animals resided first. So one day some buffalo they heard some songs coming from Wind Cave. So they got curious and they went to Wind Cave, and they wandered into Wind Cave, and that's where they met the humans. But they were in spirit. They were spirit. They were in spirit form, in spirit shape, in spirit essence. So the buffalo, the few that went in there, they ran out and called their leader, the bull. The old bull went in there and met with the leader of the spirits of the humans in Wind Cave, and told them about a life out on the outside, and to come in to see what it is. Maybe they would fit. So the spirits sent some of their warriors and some of their leaders with them. They came out with the buffalo, and they came out on top on Mother Earth, and they saw the lifestyle that the Wakantranka, the Creator, made on Mother Earth. So they went back in and they told the people what it was like out here. So here's how that story from Sievert Youngbear evolved from the old man Smoke in his story. When the spirits came out, they saw what it was like, and the sacredness of life, realized there was nobody or nothing to represent the human in two-legged form, as they had four-legged, the fish, the bird, and the insect nations. So the wind, the rain, the earth, and the sacredness came together. And the wind was moving the earth around, and the water, the rain, pulled everybody together like a glue, in the likeness of a glue matter, the matter that pulled everybody together. And the spark of life came from sacredness. And that's why we hold sacredness very dear. So the sacredness, the miracle that happened, Takushkanshkan, we say, created the life form. So, and the shape of human came into existence that represented all of life matter on earth. So they went back into Wind Cave. They call it Washunia Wind Cave, and went inside and told the spirits. So when they came out, they evolved into the human form that we have today. But they communicated with each other through language. And the only language communication method they could use was through the method of sound from the animals. And as they composed, and the song comprised of all the animals, the language took shape throughout the evolution of time. And as the language took shape, they utilized the connection to the animals all the time. And there is a reality of that in two stories that I heard and that I was told. And one of them in recent time, was there was a gathering of elders at Wind Cave to inspect and interpret some writings on the walls. They call it Hell's Canyon, the English terminology. But we call it Osmokewakan, sacred canyons. So in the canyons, there were like writings like hieroglyphs, petroglyphs on the walls. So they asked the elders from Pine Ridge to go and look at them and study them, observe them, and try to tell the forest rangers, National Park Service employees, what those interpretations were and what they meant. So when they were meeting, one of our relatives who was running from law enforcement ran into the camp, drove and ran into the camp. Well, they told him where to go hide. So as he was going in, they spotted him. They chased him into the camp in here the elders came out and said, can you leave him with us for a while? We want to sweat with him, and we want to talk with him, and we want to strengthen him if you are going to take him and lock him up. So when they chased him in, they called in the FBI, the state marshals, the highway patrol, the sheriffs, everybody, and they surrounded the camp. And so they agreed. And so they took him into Sweat that night. And a man from Standing Rock, Reginald Birdhorse, just before the morning star come out, the morning star signifies the start of day. Well, he came out with this pipe, and right before the sun came out, he sang and he called for a meadowlark, the bird. A meadowlark came and he talked to him with his sacred pipe, and he asked him if he could help him lead him out so they don't lock him up and take away his life, his freedom. So he did, and that meadowlark, when time came, there was two Unchis and Reginald and that person, and they started walking, and they walked right past the encirclement of all the federal law enforcement agencies, and employees walked right past them. The meadowlark made them invisible to everybody except them, let them right past them. Now that's one story of how they were able to communicate the language of spiritual connection to the birds, to the bird nation. Another one was, one time I was talking to Gerald One Feather, and he said when they were young, he said there was a lot of bees right above his house, right above his door at his house. So he called a really old man in Ogallala, and he came over and he loaded his sacred pipe, and he held his ritual, and he called the headman of the bees, and he called him to him, and he said he was sitting on the end of his pipe. So he was talking to him, and he told the chief, their headman, the Ritracha, he said, your people are biting my grandchildren and my kids. They're harming them. They're hurting them. Could you move your camp to another place so my children can come visit me? I am lonesome because they won't come around because of your people biting my kids all the time and my grandkids. So he sang his song and said his prayer, smoked a pipe, and he said they were gradually leaving on the fourth day. On the fourth day, there wasn't a bee around. So he said he went looking for them, and he said, way down the road in the draw, is where they set up all the bees all moved to. And that's a second story of how our elders, our sacred ways, were able to communicate with the animals. And same thing with the fish. Back in the early 60s, maybe about 61, 63, thereabouts, old woman called Elsie Flood. She's a Kea Society woman. She's a turtle woman. She called us all down to the creek, and where the creek curved off coming from the west to slightly toward the northeast, while there's a little bench area. She had us all stand there, and she tied her skirt right below her knees, and she walked into the water. And she was standing there, and while we were standing there facing her, she got a little pouch, and she took out some type of a root, and she crumpled it up into the creek, and she was singing and praying. And here a whole bunch of turtle heads peeked out, a whole bunch of small turtles to really huge turtles, and just their heads was peeking out of the water while she sang and prayed to them. She had the ability and the method, capability, and spiritual capacity to call the fish nation, the turtle nation, out because she was a society member, and she knew the language, and she had that language and the ability to communicate with the turtles. Now we had women like that were able to do things with plants. They would pray to certain plants, and they would get certain medicines and use the medicines for different ceremonies or for healing. And same thing with Leonard Crow Dog. He had that ability to speak to some of the vegetation, to identify and to communicate and find out what plants to use for healing purposes. Well, his father Henry taught him a lot of that and all of that. So he knew what to look for and what to find. So when we talk about language and the sacredness of language, we had that spiritual capability of connecting to the spirit world and bring in very powerful and profound spiritual miracles that we would use for healing and for interpreting and for communicating. And how and why that was very powerful was back in our history, we used to use a buffalo tongue because the tongue represents the part of the body that communicates, that elicits language. So we would use the buffalo tongue, but after Teddy Roosevelt wiped out over 50 million buffalo purposefully to make us starve, we didn't have any buffalo to use for our Yuipi ceremonies to communicate with our spirit and the spirit helpers that holy men would use. So in exchange, it was traded from buffalo tongue to dog tongue. So the dogs would communicate with the outside, with the spiritual world, and back to the holy man. So the dog's tongue was on the altar, and every time when I would help my Hunkau father Dawson, he would put a buffalo tongue on an altar when he needed some very powerful ceremonies. And I witnessed some ceremonies that you just would not believe. My first witnessing of a miracle was back in 65 or 64, somewhere thereabouts. One of my relatives was touched by a spirit, and so they held a ceremony to fix her, you might say. And so they got a puppy and they prepared it, and they were going into a Yupi ceremony across the creek about 400 or 500 feet away. So all us younger people were on the other side by the house. And when they started their ceremony, about 7 dogs come screaming and yelping and howling all instantaneously, all at the same time. They ran and jumped the creek. The little ones dove into the creek and swam across. And they come running over to the house, and they try to run into the house and hide because they knew that something very sacred was going on. That was my first impact of something that was not explainable. So as time went along, and that was in about 64, 65, in 75, when I first Sundance, about the second day, I believe, Dawson Nohor said, the people and the dancers did not come with pure minds and pure hearts. So we made the tree week, the cottonwood tree. So we're going to strengthen the tree. So he had us all stand around in broad daylight. He went walking toward the tree, and he was picking up a handful of sage. As he was moving along, he got to the middle. He started singing and praying, and he was leaning against the tree, holding it and tapping the tree, and you could see sparks shoot from, like Peter Pan's magic dust, shoot from the tip of the sage bundle into the cottonwood tree. That was my second visual impact of something of this world that I could not explain, that didn't have rationale. There was no scientific understanding that I could ever equate to how that could happen without comprehension. So then I knew there was sacredness out there and a method to communicate with the spiritual world. And from that time on, I started helping him. Well, I learned from him from that time. Second weekend in August 1975, I started helping him and witnessing a lot of really powerful things that took place that a person wouldn't accept. A scientific world won't accept it unless they were there and witnessed it, like I did, like a lot of us. But we knew we had these ways about us that we could, our elders knew how to connect and communicate with the outside world. We had that, we knew that, and we know of it. In today's time, there's a lot of shamanistic practices that go on, and they're not real medicine men. They're not real holy men. They're not real wakan wichasha. They're just exploiting our religion for profiting, our womanizing, our political gain, our social gain, whatever. They're not real. And if you challenge them and make them go through the drinking of the hot grease ceremony, then you can find out if they're real or not. I have too much reverence and respect for what I know and what I witnessed, and I don't play around with it. But I believe that's why a lot of our people, our nation, has gotten sick, because people have been exploiting our culture, our religion, our tradition for notoriety, for self-aggrandization, for wealth building, profiteering, whatever the case may be. And they are doing us a gross injustice by doing what they're doing. Shame on them. For me, I don't believe we're going to lose what we have, but I just know we lost a lot. So it's going to take venues like this to really educate the future generations how critical, how important our history, our tradition, our culture, our ceremony, and our language, and why the language connects it all. The language has to be revitalized with reverence, with spirituality, with tradition and honor, in order to bring back who we are, to strengthen who we are, and restore a lot of what we lost. We lost a lot. Most recently, we had an elders meeting, and two old men were talking with their hands, but we didn't get the recording material there in time. We recorded every meeting, but they didn't get there in time. But these two old men were talking with their hands. Now, when you think about that, that method of communication has disappeared. But our ancestors had to know how to communicate. If they were on a hunt and if they made noise, the game, the meat supply would run away. If we were setting up to go to war and our war leaders were shouting and hollering at each other before the charge took place, we would get wiped out. So communication is very, very critical in our way of life. The language is very critical in our way of life, but it's not to be used for profiteering or for self-enrichment or otherwise. It needs to be the evolution of revitalization needs to take place in the home with our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren. And it needs to be done with the first language speakers who know how to restore that, the origination of it, because there's different methods of using the language. You have social communication where in the home, when you talk to each other, it has a different dynamics to it. There's a different type of flow to it. The mechanisms of it are different. When you go out in public and you're at a meeting, it's different with the gathering of the headmen, the Itchacha, when they'd meet, they communicate. Their language is different than in a social family home setting. When you go to a spiritual event, a sweat, a Sundance, the way they speak there is different. When you go to a powwow gathering, you hear a powwow announcer talk. Their method of speaking and communicating is really different also. So there, it's totally different from event venues to each other. And the language is very important. Every nation has its own history of language and how they use it. Well, we need to restore it back to the tradition and the history, the old way. I always try to use the old way. When I say tradition, I get challenged by profiteers and people that have personal agendas or what have you. I just say the old way because I was taught old way. My first language is Lakota. My first conduct is Lakota. When I speak in my language, I also conduct myself according to the way I was taught in the teachings of the old language and the teachings of my cultural atonement to who the family I represent and the Tioshpaya I come from. So that's me in my way of life, my thinking. Now, my philosophy is we can revitalize our identity if we go back to the purest and the oldest form of speaking the Lakota language. And the first language speakers, when they speak, it has a very fluid, it's the fluidity of it flows very positively, where it incorporates a lot of other meanings and interpretations and purposes. Whereas if you write a sentence in a Lakota language book, you can make a sentence, but you're not incorporating the full and the true expression of that language. It would mean just one purpose, just one function. But in the Lakota language, it incorporates a whole lot of other purposes and identifications. Like one word, Oana Seltanka, the Great Sioux Nation and all its inhabitants. Black Hills, Wa'alia Chimpi, the land I am so desirous to be standing upon. Tokio Preaki Chiapelo, the old word for trade and barter in an economic sense. Humbleblekel, I created my lifestyle as to how I live today. So the interpretation of one word means so much that you can't just write it down in one little simple word. There's a whole lot more meaning to it than just that. Now, behind that is the significant value of its ultimate goal, but while the origination of it is spiritual. So mind you, everything about who we are and what we are and our language is very spiritual. And the sacredness of it is very powerful. And when you live your life in a very true sacredness, it belies your origination and the history of who you are and where you come from. Now, if I represented my family and my Tioshpaya improperly, I would dishonor them. But I would lose the value of its purity in the language and the expression of language. And the language is much more than words. It's your conduct, it's your behavior, it's your function, your purpose, your responsibility to the people. So language is very important, very critical, and it's extremely powerful when it's reverted back to its origination. And that's how and where it comes from in the first language's origination and history. So the purpose of language, in my belief, is every nation has their language, their first language. Speakers know who speaks it. The language is also in our history the connection to the animal kingdom and how we communicated. And the language to each other is how we connect with one Tioshpaya to another. But most importantly, our language in a spiritual way. When a holy man goes up on a hill, or a woman, a grandma, when they go up on a hill to communicate with the Creator, the language is very powerful. Now, those that have been in very historic and traditional and strong spiritual ceremony and have heard a language they could not interpret or understand, those are the spirits that are talking. But the one that's gifted to interpret that is your interpreter. We say Ieska, interpreter. And that interpreter interprets from the outside world, the other world, the spiritual world, to that interpreter, Ieska, and on to the people. So the language is very sacred, very, very sacred, and should be respected as such and recognized as such. So the language is just the ultimate empirical recognition and acknowledgement of a spiritual way of life. And the future is needing that very much, and it's very critical we revert back to that and all that it entails for our future generation and our way of life. So we have a future that we can we'll have well into the centuries to come. Hohoka he ho ami taku e pilechel I hoagala kina lila taku kota o chichiaka pi yunka ho he etan tuktel hiuki mitroya tina wotaku e pi hena echa yuha achihiupi na chichupi ho heta han trokata ki a wichoin chache na wakanja ki hena echa le I wogla kapi ki he wakantranka ki chi wogla kapi na wo ayupta he ikichupi na wapia inkichupi ho lupeju tapi ki hena echa ulapi he ho wiochpiata ki wakion o ya te wakon ya te lecha wilota ke ki hecha wilota ke letki kayuta yo na wo ayupta upie wa woke unichi la pelo trokata ke wichuin chache unki lazata hiupi ki woke ulapi ho asiata tratranko ya te pte sawi pte hinchala chano pa wakon yaka hiupi ki heli ochla te wopre shakoi o ya te yuhani na jipi ho hena echa unki washtepi na lupeju tapi ho echel uzani pi he wopila echalo na traha unguluta pi na uzani pi na woyu talo na woyu te na traha ki hena o kalia niung umpi chai wopila echalo ho yohi ampatakia traksha o ya te sinte sapela ampetu yohi ampetu wi makocha opuzia na yupejuta ho echel woyu te na pejuta washteste unki chaha pi unka wopila echalo huyunka he ampetu yohi oyate tiwahe wichot khachi unki washte pi ampetu yohi ho hechel tiwahe hena echa uwashte pi na uwa kampi na wash akapi na asaselia ni unkumpelo chawu pila echalo ho itoka khata zintkala oyate mambli oyate anukasa ho zintkala oyate ni echa wakantranka echi kela wocheki echa kila aye yunka he unke pilunki api chawo pila unke ha pela unshuki la po na wopila ulapi unshuki la po otunkashi la wakantranka hechi wakata wichasha katula istawa unshila lo haki kamakata ke unkayuta yona wawoke unkupie honi echa etaha wawoke yuha ni unkupi chunke wopila unke ha pelo yunka umpetu ki le chiltaku wonspena woslole ki hena ya ithowaze ki he uyopta uchoin chakhun kilazata uchonku uchunke apikte ho o hiatranka he makaka siohe ukigna kapi ki he woslole na wonsbe na woksape eukigna kapi ho echel wa bleze yu hapikta chunke upila unke hapelo unshu kila pono wa ayupta unkupia wa piana wichozani wota kuyepi wichakupo unshia hoye wa lo na michi ho unchi phamon kichu unchi niecha uyute na pejuta uyakupi na pejuta trokahe minikaluza ha hel hyuki oyate wichozani na wichoni hetaha makani unkumpi na tu hal tu wichoni eken egna kapiki hekta kya makoche op uzie lupejuta na yupejuta ho hecha trokata kya takuko washteste ota kichanye hohe oyate ni unkumpelo chinkempetu kile wopila unkapelo unshu kila pompetu kile hole melo akil najipi unsha hoye welo na michi kho ampetu kile unsha wachechi chalo na michi kho haye hokahe